China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. Russia vows a harsh response to attacks on its Belgorod region as both Ukraine and the United States deny any involvement. Ukraine says the 9-month battle for Bakhmut is not over yet, despite Russian claims to have captured the city. Our other headlines: fighter jets and clashes reported in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the second day of a new humanitarian ceasefire. And the race for the White House. Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to announce his presidential bid in the coming hours. Russia has promised a harsh response after releasing images which it claims show US-made military vehicles used in an attack on its territory. The pictures claim to show damaged Western armoured trucks, including US Humvees. Some Ukrainian military experts say these pictures are doctored. Fighting has been taking place in the Russian border region of Belgorod over the past 2 days. Russia blames Ukrainian insurgents and says the group has been defeated, with at least 70 killed. The United States has denied involvement, as has Kyiv, which says the attacks were launched by Russian opposition paramilitary groups. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Stuart Smith, in Moscow. Stuart, so clearly conflicting reports on what's happening in Belgorod. What does Russia have to say?
Yeah, well, the Moscow officials here say that they're in no doubt, that they believe this is evidence of continued US involvement in the so-called special military operation by virtue of the fact that they are American vehicles. The Kremlin says that's further evidence of US involvement. Now, there's some doubt, as you suggested, about the veracity of the photographs and videos. It's also possible that these vehicles did come from other places. ISIS, for example, had US Humvees, which originally came from Iraq, but the Kremlin interpreting this as only one thing, which is that it's the Ukrainian and the United States governments working together to allow incursions onto Russian territory. Now, the United States says that's not the deal it has with Ukraine, that it is allowed to use American weapons and vehicles only within Ukrainian territory. Now, of course, Russia and Ukraine differ about where Ukrainian territory is, but certainly it wouldn't be sanctioned for something like we saw earlier this week. In terms of the latest in Belgorod, the counter-terror operation has ended there. The latest we've heard upon the rebuilding process is that 500 buildings were damaged, according to a local governor, and they're looking to get people back into their homes and reconnect gas supplies. The Kremlin says it will do, the border force and the defense ministry will do what they need to do to keep the border safe.
Elsewhere, Russia says it's moving a nuclear submarine to what it calls a permanent location. What more do we know about that?
Yeah, this is Russia's newest type of nuclear submarine. It's currently based in the Arctic as part of Russia's Northern Fleet. The Ministry of Defense says it's going to make its way under the sea towards the Pacific, where it will be based with the Eastern Military District. Now, that makes countries like Japan rather concerned, because Russia and Japan have a territorial dispute dating back to World War II. And so this kind of increased presence in the Pacific does concern some nations. But of course, Russia says, as with all of its nuclear-capable missiles and delivery systems, that it is only going to use any nuclear threat in the event of an existential threat to Russian territory itself.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Stuart Smith, in Moscow. Well, Ukraine says the 9-month battle for the besieged city of Bakhmut is far from over. Kyiv says its forces have made gains against Russia on the edge of the city. This comes as Moscow claims to have captured Bakhmut. Meanwhile, Britain's Defence Minister Ben Wallace has been visiting Kyiv, where he committed Ukraine's allies would not be divided.
The international community will only get stronger in their opposition to this aggression. We will always be standing by Ukraine, and not only through this war, but long afterwards.
Well, China is stepping up mediation talks on the Ukraine conflict, with Special Representative Li Hui meeting senior officials in France, the latest stop on his diplomatic tour of Europe. He's hoping to secure a ceasefire following his visit to Ukraine last week. Let's talk to our correspondent, Nathalie Malhas in Paris. Nathalie, talk us through the plan for this European tour.
Central to the agenda here on the continent, Jamie, is those peace talks bringing about a swift resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. Li Hui is one of the most senior representatives of China to touch down in Kyiv just last week. This week he was in France, and part of his itinerary, we understand, visits to Poland and Germany, among others. As you mentioned, China has centered itself as the mediator in the conflict playing out in Ukraine at the moment, pushing for a ceasefire and also continuing its push for a political solution to the crisis playing out in Ukraine. We know from his meeting with the Director General in the Foreign Affairs Office in France this week that both China and France have agreed on some fundamental points around the conflict in Ukraine, including Ukraine's right to self-defense, its independence and territorial integrity. But central to the agenda and all the talking points that will be playing out over the next few days is that of peace, brokering a swift, just and fair peace deal in Ukraine between those two warring parties.
Nathalie, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Nathalie Malhas in Paris. Well, China's President Xi Jinping has met Russia's visiting Prime Minister in Beijing. Mikhail Mishustin says ties with China are at an unprecedented high. Our correspondent, Lucia Ray, reports.
Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin just landed in Beijing last night. And this morning, Chinese Premier Li Qiang held a ceremony to welcome Mishustin's official visit in China, and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng and also Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang also attended the ceremony. And after the ceremony, Li Qiang held talks with Mishustin. In the afternoon, Chinese President Xi Jinping also met with Mishustin at the Great Hall of the People. And Xi Jinping said China will support Russia on issues relating to core interests, and the two should fully discover economic growth points together and potentials for further cooperation. And Mishustin said Russia is willing to deepen cooperation with China and also to create a multipolar world together with China based on international law. And after the meeting with Xi, Mishustin laid a wreath at the monument to the people's heroes.
Fighter jets and clashes have been reported in Sudan's capital, breaking a ceasefire after just 2 days. The week-long truce was meant to allow aid to be delivered and pave the way for a more lasting peace. The United Nations Human Rights Chief says civilians are trapped in Khartoum and has urged the warring generals to stop what he called the senseless violence. Well, hundreds of people have now been killed since the fighting broke out over 5 weeks ago, and more than 1 million people have fled the country. Many have crossed into Chad, but the conflict has followed them, spilling over into the border. It's prompted the Chadian government to boost security. CGTN's correspondent Panina Karib reports.
Khartoum is Chad's last frontier on the border with Sudan. But this small and sleepy trading center has generated a lot of attention in the country. Just last week, a rocket crossed over from Sudan and landed here.
There was a lot of fighting. People were fleeing and crossing over to this side. Some of the attackers fired a rocket at the people who were fleeing. Fortunately, it did not explode. It got lodged into the ground. If it had exploded, it would have caused a lot of damage in this town.
I'm at the Tendelti border. Sudan is less than a kilometer from here, where you see those many trees. That is actually Tendelti town in Sudan. And where I'm standing now is where that rocket landed. Khartoum town has now become a front line in a conflict it has nothing to do with.
So far, those who have borne the brunt of the spillover from the conflict in Sudan are the most vulnerable.
In Kufun, not far away from the border, in a town inside Chad, a few days ago we had an incident when one refugee was killed. So it is a huge concern that we have.
Kufun is one of the 27 entry points along the Sudan-Chad border for the refugees. The Chadian government says it is doing its best to secure those entry points.
Due to the unfortunate incident which happened recently, we have decided to secure the border here in the east. We've taken all necessary measures to ensure security along the border is good.
Those assurances, however, have done little to quell the fears of those living in this town.
We are very scared. Even though it's quiet across the border, we don't know when it will flare up again and how it will affect us.
Yet another example of how the continuing conflict in Sudan is elevating the humanitarian crisis in Chad. Penina Karibe, CGTN, in Kufun, Eastern Chad.
The UK has recorded the sharpest fall in inflation since the cost of living crisis began in late 2021. It fell to 8.7% in April. That's the first time the rate has hit single figures since August last year. But core inflation, which excludes energy and food prices, has risen to a 31-year high of 6.8%. The Office for National Statistics said food prices continue to be worryingly high. The former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says new claims that he broke lockdown rules during the pandemic are bizarre and unacceptable. He's been referred to the police after ministerial diaries showed details of visits by friends to the Prime Minister's country residence. Johnson was previously fined for attending an event to celebrate his birthday at Downing Street in 2020. Police in Guyana say a deadly fire at a school dormitory appears to have been started by a student who'd had her phone confiscated. 19 people, mostly female students, were killed. The teenage suspect is in hospital with burns and has reportedly admitted arson. The authorities are considering whether to charge her. Richard Branson's space company Virgin Orbit has been closed down with its assets sold for about $36 million. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in April after failing to secure new funding. This comes just months after its first ever satellite launch in the UK ended in failure, with the rocket falling short of its target orbit. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, why the debate over lab-grown meat is rather difficult to swallow in Italy.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Russia vows a harsh response to attacks on its Belgorod region as both Ukraine and the United States deny any involvement. Our other headlines: fighter jets and clashes reported in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the second day of a new humanitarian ceasefire. China's new ambassador to the United States says he hopes the relationship between the two countries can improve. Xie Feng takes up his role amid continuing friction on trade, technology and geopolitics. He says there are serious challenges ahead.
We hope that the United States will move in the same direction with China. We hope that the United States will work together with China to increase dialogue, to manage differences, and also to expand our cooperation so that our relationship will be back to the right track.
Well, he's taking up his job at an interesting time. The new ambassador's arrival comes as the 2024 US presidential race starts to heat up. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. Tell us more about Ron DeSantis, then, the man who's about to launch his presidential campaign.
You know, Jamie, there's an old Chinese proverb that goes, may you live in interesting times. And boy, oh boy, that ambassador is coming over to Washington, D.C. at an interesting time because the presidential race is really hotting up now. This is our big story in America today because Ron DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida, is going to announce that he's formally in the race. Now, you don't get to choose when you run to be president of the United States. If you remember, Barack Obama back in 2007, 2008 was only a first-term senator. And they said to him, you've got to run, it's your time. And so it is true with Ron DeSantis as well. Lots of chatter, a real head of steam building up about this man that you see. Now, the thing is, he's still far, far behind former President Trump among Republican voters who must choose someone to represent them in the presidential election next year. In fact, Trump is 36 points ahead of Ron DeSantis at the moment. DeSantis is the very popular governor of the southern state of Florida. He has a made-for-TV family, although I think in recent weeks it's become clear that he certainly doesn't have anything like the personality that President Trump has, and that may hamper him. He's going to say when he announces in a few hours' time, look, Republican voters, I am Trump. He's actually positioning himself slightly to the right of Trump, but he's going to say, look, he's going to say, I am Trump, but without the baggage. That's going to be his main calling card. And he's going to do that at 22 hours GMT today on Twitter. Elon Musk, the boss of Twitter, will host a Q&A session with him. And I think this is the first real sweep at Donald Trump, because remember, Trump is on Twitter now with 80 million followers or whatever, but he doesn't use it. He prefers his own Truth Social because he thinks that's where the big Republican Party donors are. And here is DeSantis, his great rival, announcing on Twitter that he's going to run against President Trump. And it's going to be a bitter, bitter campaign between them. Very bitter indeed, I promise you that.
I know you're not a gambling man, but what are his chances if you were?
Well, you do have to remember, and it's not clear overseas, I realize this, but President Trump is extremely popular among Republican voters. I just told you he was almost 46 points ahead of DeSantis in the poll I saw just now. It's also a crowded space now as well. I'll just list the other contenders. They won't mean much overseas, I understand that, but let's just list them anyway. Nikki Haley is the former governor of South Carolina. Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas. Vivek Ramaswamy is a businessman and entrepreneur, and Tim Scott is an African-American, very popular Republican who is a senator in South Carolina. Now, the first TV debate will be in August for the Republicans. The first actual votes will be cast in February. And Ron DeSantis, as you know, has been rowing with Disney. He thinks they're too woke. They think he's trying to ruin their business. He has very, very strong, very Republican views on abortion and LGBTQ rights as well. And President Biden is betting that both of these men, while they may be popular within the Republican Party, do not have the same national appeal when it comes to the presidential that President Biden has proved he has on one occasion now, and again with his party in the midterms last November.
John, good to see you. Thanks for that. Our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. Now, we need to lose less water. That's the message in the United States. Negotiations among 3 U.S. states over water consumption from the Colorado River seem to have turned out to be successful. California, Arizona and Nevada have all agreed to cut their reliance on the drought-ravaged river. Our correspondent, Hendrik Sabrandi, reports.
For the past few decades, the Colorado River, which supplies drinking water to 40 million Americans and irrigates vast farmland in the southwest U.S., has been under severe stress. Drought, population growth, and climate change have dropped river flows by 1/3 compared to historic averages, making a water and power crisis a real possibility.
That would be catastrophic. No water running in the Grand Canyon, or no water running below Lake Mead to the millions of acres of agriculture. You know, the cities that depend on that water.
On Monday, the lower Colorado Basin states of California, Arizona, and Nevada headed off potential disaster by agreeing to 3.7 million megaliters of water cuts over the next 3 years, or 13% of their river allocation. The federal government will pay the states $1.2 billion in exchange.
I thought it was interesting. It did kind of come, I guess I'd say, a little unexpectedly.
Water expert John Tracy at Colorado State University says the federal government had threatened to impose cuts on states this summer.
We can't continue to use water in the Colorado River unsustainably, and that's what we're doing right now.
University of Colorado's Mark Squillace's March warning came as a wetter and snowier winter than normal was wrapping up.
It's very clear that having a pretty good snow year really helped in terms of avoiding having to make a hard decision this year.
But hard decisions lie ahead for the wider region, the 7 states in the Colorado Basin. A super dry year could upend the new agreement, which runs until 2026. While encouraged by the breakthrough deal, Tracy worries it could hurt the marginalized, the poor.
I'm also hoping that these reductions in water use don't lead to increased costs in water for those groups, because that's just going to drive a higher level of water insecurity for those individuals and communities.
Even before the agreement, Las Vegas, Nevada had taken big steps to conserve water by doing things like banning traditional lawns and capping the size of swimming pools.
We've seen water use decline in our community by greater than 30%, while our population has increased by more than 50%.
The question is, will other places be as aggressive now that a deal is in place?
Is everybody trying to reduce their use by close to 1 million acre-feet a year? Or is it kind of like, oh, we got the water, so we'll do the reductions next year and the next year? I always like to say I was born in Missouri, and so it's the show me state. So I tell you what, just show me, just show me.
For the moment, the critical lakes Mead and Powell, where water has been dropping, have a level of protection.
We have another year of super poor runoff. The agreement itself acknowledges that we could be in that danger zone again.
That danger zone is out of the Colorado River picture, at least for now. Hendrik Sabrandi, CGTN, Denver.
Israel's parliament has passed a new budget, bolstering Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after months of protests over his judicial reform plans. Netanyahu's hinted his government could now revive the proposals which were suspended in March. More protests are expected. India has struck deals on migration and clean energy with Australia. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting the country to discuss regional security and economic ties with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. They signed a plan making it easier for Indian students and business people to move to Australia, and will set up a joint hydrogen task force to expand clean energy cooperation. A 95-year-old woman who was tasered by Australian police at a care home has died. Claire Noland, who had dementia, was critically hurt after the police responded to reports that she was wandering around the home with a steak knife. The police say they're investigating. The Spanish football club Valencia has been hit with a nearly $50,000 fine and the temporary closure of a section of its stadium after racist abuse aimed at Real Madrid player Vinicius Jr. The Brazilian was subject to alleged monkey chants from the crowd during a league game on Sunday. Valencia says the sanction is unfair and will appeal. A debate over meat is proving rather difficult to swallow. In Italy, it could become the first country in the world to ban lab-grown meat, with a new law being debated by Parliament later this month. But if EU regulators authorise the sale of cultivated meat products in the future, it would contradict the Italian government's position. Our correspondent Alex Fraser reports.
Innovations designed to be a sustainable, low-emission alternative to meat. Chicken cultivated in huge vats in the United States, a giant meatball grown from extinct mammoth DNA in the Netherlands. Both would be banned in Italy if a new law prohibiting the production and marketing of lab-grown meat receives parliamentary approval. Giorgia Meloni's government proposed fines of more than $65,000 for violators, positioning themselves as the defenders of agriculture and a Mediterranean diet. Critics have accused the Italian government of using this issue as part of a wider culture war, but they have the support of many farmers who feel threatened by the emergence of lab-grown meat. Italy's farming association Coldiretti has led a campaign against cultured meat, calling it Frankenstein food.
Coldiretti gathered millions of signatures against the production of synthetic food, against the commercialisation and importation of this type of food into our country. We have tried to advise the minister in drafting the law that will pass Parliament in the coming weeks. Luigi Gargioni's family have been farming cattle for generations in the northern province of Cremona. He's worried that if it receives EU approval, lab-grown meat would threaten Italian food culture.
The European Union wants to go forward with synthetic meat. Instead, our government are opposing it to defend our Italian excellence and quality that we have in our territory that other countries do not have. Brothers of Italy are on our side.
Like these scientists in Japan, Bruno Cell researches cultivated meat. It's the only startup of its kind in Italy. The bill doesn't ban research in the sector, but researchers argue that Italian innovators will be left behind by rivals in other nations.
For a while, cultivated meat won't be produced in Italy, but from the moment in which the EU will approve the consumption of product based on cultivated meat, then it will be possible to market the product also in Italy. So it's just a way, in our opinion, to prevent Italian companies and researchers to enter this market.
Italians are passionate about their food culture. Meat plays a central part. Will this new law be a case of gastro-nationalism, or is the Italian government justified in protecting farmers and consumers from what they see as an external threat? Alex Fraser, CGTN, Milan.
And finally, 2 ancient shipwrecks have been discovered 1,500 metres underwater in the South China Sea. The vessels are thought to be at least 500 years old. One ship contains more than 10,000 porcelain relics dating back to the Ming Dynasty. The joint discovery is one of China's major deep-sea finds. Archaeologists say the wrecks provide significant clues about ancient maritime Silk Road trade routes. The headlines again. Russia vows a harsh response to attacks on its Belgorod region as both Ukraine and the United States deny any involvement. Our other headlines: fighter jets and clashes reported in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the second day of a new humanitarian ceasefire. And Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to announce his United States presidential bid in the coming hours. And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next is World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.